What is the strangest material from which anyone has ever made a musical instrument? Wood is obvious. Metal is obvious. Clay, shell, reed, skin, gut, all of these make sense. But bone? That feels different. A flute made from bone has a certain atmosphere, doesn't it? It's not exactly the sort of thing one brings out at a children's birthday party. Would anyone like a tune on the femur? No, probably not. And yet, bone is one of the most natural materials imaginable for making a musical instrument. It is hard, it is hollow, it is durable, it is portable. And, depending upon whose bone it is, it may already come with a story attached. This is the Musical Archeologist, forgotten ideas from music's past. I'm Craig Dabelstein, and in this series I'm taking ideas from old books on music, most of them completely forgotten, and bringing them back into conversation with the present. Today's idea comes from Ernest Closson's 1902 book, The Musical Instrument as an Ethnographic Document. In earlier episodes, we've looked at Closson's larger argument, that musical instruments are not just machines for producing sound, they are documents. They tell us about culture, technology, migration, ritual, imagination, and human need. But today, we are entering one of the darker corners of organology. Today, we are talking about the bone flute. Now, the first thing to say is that there is nothing especially mysterious about bone as a material. From a practical point of view, it's extremely useful. Closson points out that animal bone, and sometimes even human bone, was occasionally substituted for reed in the making of flutes. And he gives the reason quite plainly. The material is both rigid and hollow. That's all a flute maker really needs to get started. A hollow tube, air, a few holes, and someone prepared to blow into it. The difficulty, of course, is that once you know what the tube used to be attached to, the whole thing becomes rather less innocent. A reed flute suggests pastoral simplicity. A wooden flute suggests nature. A silver flute suggests refinement. A bone flute suggests that something has gone terribly wrong. Closson himself cannot resist this. He writes with magnificent scholarly understatement that one must admit there was a rather singular pleasure, a refinement of a particularly pungent kind, in fashioning from the femur of a fallen enemy a flute or a trumpet. That is a sentence only a musicologist could write. Most people would say, that is horrifying. Closson says, that is a rather singular pleasure. And this is one of the delights of reading old books. Every now and then, in the middle of a respectable scholarly discussion, the author calmly opens a small trapdoor into the abyss. But Closson is not simply being sensational. He is pointing to something important. Bone instruments are not merely grotesque curiosities. They appear in many places, in many forms, and across long periods of time. The Latin word tibia, the generic name for the ancient reed pipe, also means shin bone. The very name hints at the animal origin of many early pipe instruments. Closson notes that Pollux mentions an Egyptian flute made from the leg bone of a bear. In the Finnish Kalevala, the hero Kullervo fashions a trumpet from a cow's bone and a horn from a calf's foot. In 1608, the Archdukes Albert and Isabella presented to the Guild of St. Sebastian a flageolet made from a sheep's bone decorated with silver ferrules. And Closson mentions a Native American flute made from the bone of an eagle. So the bone flute is not merely a prehistoric oddity, it belongs to a wider human habit of turning the remains of living creatures into sounding objects. Now, we could view this entirely practically. Bone was available, bone was strong, bone lasted, bone could be worked, bone could sound. But human beings rarely leave things at the practical level. We are symbolic creatures. We can't even make a cup of tea without it turning into ritual. So, when bone becomes music, the imagination begins to stir. What does it mean to make sound from what was once alive? What does it mean for the dead to sing? What does it mean for an animal, an enemy, a victim, or an ancestor to become an instrument? This is where the story becomes wonderfully macabre. Closson notes that numerous legends attest the popularity of the bone flute. He refers to the work of Eugene Monsieur, who collected many versions of a folk tale concerning what is often called the singing bone. The pattern appears in many places. Someone is murdered, the body is hidden, a bone is found, the bone is made into a flute or a whistle or some other sounding object. And when the instrument is played, it reveals the truth. It sings the crime and it names the murderer. It refuses to stay silent. This is one of the great ideas of folklore. The dead may be buried, but they are not necessarily quiet. In ordinary life, this would be inconvenient. In folklore, it is justice. Imagine being the murderer in one of these stories. You have committed the crime, you have hidden the evidence, you are beginning to relax. And then one day, someone arrives in the village with a charming new wind instrument. Gee, lovely tone, you think. A little nasal perhaps, but very affecting. And then the flute begins to sing, "He killed me." At that point, the review just writes itself. The instrument has limited range, but excellent courtroom value. This is what makes the bone flute so fascinating. It sits at the meeting point of music, death, memory, and accusation. The body becomes evidence, the evidence becomes sound, the sound becomes truth, and truth becomes impossible to silence. That's a very powerful idea. It tells us something about how deeply human beings have associated music with voice. A bone flute is not literally a person speaking, but in the legend it becomes a voice for the voiceless. The dead cannot testify, but the bone can. This may sound like superstition, but the symbolism is beautiful. Music gives presence to absence. That is one of its oldest powers. A person is gone, and yet something remains. A trace, a vibration, a sound. The idea that an instrument might carry memory is not as strange as it first appears. We still feel something like this today. We speak of an old violin as though it remembers the hands that played it. We treat instruments associated with great musicians almost like relics. A trumpet owned by a famous player, a conductor's baton, a composer's piano. These objects seem to carry more than wood, metal, ivory, or felt. They carry contact and history and touch. The bone flute takes that feeling to its most extreme form. Here, the material is not merely associated with life, it was life. And perhaps that is why the idea is so unsettling. The instrument is not just made by a person, it may be made from a person. Or from an animal that once breathed, moved, fled, hunted, or sang in its own way. A bird bone flute is especially suggestive. Birds already belong to the world of song. To make a flute from the bone of a bird is almost to return song to the body from which it came, though admittedly by a route the bird might not have chosen. There is a grim poetry in that, and Closson, with his calm catalogue of examples, reminds us that early musical history was not as sanitised as we sometimes imagine. Modern concert life can make instruments seem elegant, polished, and respectable. The flute gleams, the violin is varnished, the piano is black and dignified, the orchestra sits under lights, everyone has their shoes on. But beneath that world lies a much older and stranger one. A world of horns, skins, guts, shells, bones, bladders, gourds, reeds, and hooves. A world in which music was close to hunting, ritual, magic, work, war, and death. The bone flute belongs to that world. It reminds us that the history of music is not only beautiful, it's also earthy and practical, it's comic, it's brutal, and it is occasionally disgusting. And it is so profoundly human. Because human beings have always made meaning from whatever lies at hand. A reed in the marsh, a shell on the shore, a horn from an animal, a skin stretched over a frame, a bone left behind. We find things, we alter them, we blow through them, we strike them, and we listen. And then, somehow, they become part of our story. The bone flute is strange because it collapses the distance between life and art. It says that music does not always arise from refinement. Sometimes it arises from remains. And that may be why the old legends are so compelling. The murdered body becomes music, the hidden crime becomes song, and the silent bone becomes testimony. In these stories, music is not entertainment, it is revelation. It's the thing that speaks when ordinary speech has failed. So yes, the bone flute is macabre. It is slightly ridiculous. It is not perhaps the ideal instrument for a wedding reception. but it contains one of the oldest and most haunting ideas in the human imagination: that sound can remember, and that even a bone, under the right circumstances, may have something to say. You've been listening to The Musical Archeologist, forgotten ideas from music's past. Written and presented by me, Craig Dabelstein. The music for this podcast was composed by Jeffrey Young. The Musical Archeologist is one of many projects from Maxime's Music, dedicated to recovering forgotten music, forgotten writings, and forgotten musical worlds. Thank you for listening.